I'm Angel Rabasa from the RAND Corporation. And first of all, I would like to thank the Rumi Forum and the organizers of this event for giving me the honor of moderating this event. I have to start by commending the Rumi Forum for the very useful and important work that it has been doing in the years since I have come into contact with the Rumi Forum. The forum has become, I think, one of the most important venues in Washington for the discussion of issues not only relating to Turkey, which is a key partner and ally of the United States, but of issues relating to Islam more generally. And in this vein, the Rumi Forum has contributed, I think, to a better understanding of very complex issues in Islam and to a better dialogue among the major Abrahamic faiths. I think I might be drifting away from the subject of this discussion, but I wanted to highlight the very important contribution that the Rumi Forum has made to a very, very broad range of issues of great importance and interest today. Concerning the discussion today, before I introduce the panelists and I'll let them do all the talking, I'd like to take just a few moments to provide some historical context to what is going on today from my own personal perspective. Because in the 25 years, almost 25 years, since I had been involved with Turkey, and I used to be a Turkish desk officer in the State Department back in the days of Turgut Özal, that I don't think that there has been any time when the gap between Turkey and the United States has been as great as it is today. And this is why events like this are so important. Now, this is not to say that there were not tensions in the relationship even in the best of days, because I remember in the mid-80s, when Turkey and the United States were very, very close, and they still are to a very large extent. But even in those days, which was perhaps the time when the U.S.-Turkish relationship was closest, there were tensions in the relationship. There were tensions related to Cyprus, related to the inevitable Armenian genocide resolutions that used to come up even then in Congress every year, tensions with regard to Greek-Turkish disputes over overflights in the Aegean, issues of human rights, issues and controversies relating to the renegotiation of the Defense and Economic Cooperation Agreement, which is a linchpin of the defense relationship between Turkey and the United States. And I have to say that the Turks were probably the toughest negotiators that I ever found in my experience in the State Department. So you could be friends and you could really disagree. But even then, all of these issues, all of these tensions could be overcome because there was agreement on the fundamentals. And Turkey and the United States shared a vision of the strategic challenges facing both our countries and what needed to be done to confront these challenges. Now the question is whether we're still on the same page, whether we are moving on parallel tracks, and as the report states, whether Turkey can contribute to the relationship in new and unexpected ways, or whether we are on divergent paths. And I think that this is, one of the key issues of our day in terms of the U.S.-Turkish relationship. But I'll let our speakers address these issues as well as other issues in the report. And let me quickly introduce Joshua Walker. He is, they're both at Transatlantic, at the Transatlantic Academy this year. Joshua is going next year to Harvard and Brandeis, which is a great combination, since I attended myself one of those. And then after that, he'll be going to the University of Richmond Jepson School. Juliette Tolay, also a transatlantic fellow, has conducted research on Turkish foreign policy and migration. She studied at what I gathered to be the Sciences Polytechnique in Paris, and brings, of course, a very special perspective. So we expect special eloquence from Juliette in this presentation. So having said that, I'll just turn over the floor to our discussants.
Well, thank you very much. I think you've done a great job in terms of kind of laying out the historical context, and I don't need to go through that. It's great to be here. It's great to be able to have a group to have a discussion with. I see a lot of friends in the audience. So I think we're going to try to keep this as short as possible, but to try to give you some meat and some kind of some food for thought, since we've already had some physical food put in our belly. I think, as our moderators already laid out, the question before us today is one of kind of context. It's very easy in a Washington environment to be caught up in a crisis. And what's happened in the last 3 weeks, maybe even the last 2 years in terms of Turkey and who lost Turkey debate. That's what you hear around town. Those of us that have been looking at Turkey for a very long period of time go crazy anytime people begin to ask these questions. And who lost Turkey and whose side is it on? Are they switching sides? There's this discussion and this hysteria, whether it's on Capitol Hill or on K Street or among different think tanks these days. And unfortunately, we're asking the wrong questions. Juliette and I have just finished 10 months at the Transatlantic Academy, as we were just introduced as, and we just produced the report, Getting to Zero, Turkey, its Neighbors in the West. And Getting to Zero is reference to zero problems with neighbor policy that the current Foreign Minister, Ahmet Davutoğlu, has been talking about since the moment he came into office, and also even before that as an advisor. And so the real question is there something that's fundamentally changed in Turkey? And I think our argument is yes, there's some major fundamental changes that need to be understood in this town and around the world. And sometimes when we look at Turkey and the questions that we have for Turkey, we have a Cold War mentality in a 21st century environment. And I think it's first important to understand that there's been a major change. I don't think I need to explain to an audience such as this what's happened since the Cold War. But I do think it's important to point out a few kind of key aspects. Turkey's been a NATO member since 1952. It's been on the road to the European Union or the European Community since 1963. There was never a discussion of whether Turkey was part of the West or not. It was. It was with us against the communists. There was no question about that. Now, in a post-Cold War environment, the questions began to change. No longer was it a discussion about kind of the West and capitalism against communism. It became a question of really, do we have a common strategic vision? Do we have a common formula? One of the interesting things that our moderators already pointed out is, before the current party in power, the Justice and Development Party, it wasn't that Turkey didn't exist. It wasn't that there was no political leadership in Turkey. In fact, I would argue that the current government in power has continued on the successful policies of the previous administrations. So it's a bit disingenuous sometimes on the part of the foreign minister, the prime minister, to claim that the new Turkish foreign policy is new. In fact, I see a lot of continuation from the period of Turgut Özal. Özal's vision of kind of Turkey as a larger player, to reclaim some of its Ottoman past, to be able to go back to a neighborhood that it once dominated. This rhetoric, which to many in the West sounded very new and very scary, is not new at all in the Turkish context. We've heard this before in the idea of Özal. But what is different? Well, I think what's different is us in a lot of different ways. I'm going to talk a lot about the U.S. strategic focus and try to focus on that relationship. I'm going to let Juliette focus mostly on the European Union side of things and maybe some of the more domestic factors. But I think it's important to understand that in a post-9/11 environment, the United States began to see Turkey through a very different lens. The idea that after 9/11, the Bush administration was seeking a partner to wage a war on terror that would not be perceived as a war on Islam, Turkey fit that motif very well. It's the only Muslim majority nation that is a NATO member. It's the only nation that's with us in Afghanistan with combat troops on the ground that is Muslim majority. It fits our interests in a lot of different ways. And when you think about what the Bush administration with the neoconservative movement did, they saw Turkey more or less like a model, as kind of the model or the moderate Islam that we were trying to promote. And in fact, I would say that, as much as we may be upset about some of the actions of the current government, we created this monster. In 2002, when the AKP swept to power, in December of that year, the current prime minister, who was only the party leader at that point in time, was invited on an official visit to Washington in December. First time this has happened in U.S. history. In other words, we invited a non-government official for an official visit because we understood that he was the real primary political power there. And we invited him, and this was seen in Turkey among the different factional groups. Anybody who understands Turkish politics knows how important Washington's approval and also the legitimacy that this visit gave to Tayyip Erdogan. And so when he came and he met with Bush and there was a strategic dialogue, there was an understanding in Turkey that, okay, this is the guy who's going to lead Turkey. This is the most important factor. Clearly, with the Iraq War vote, the prime minister, who was the party leader, and the AKP were in support of the resolution for American troops to go through northern Iraq. It failed because he was not able to bring his own party and the opposition parties together. And the U.S. in many ways failed to articulate what our agenda and why we were doing what we did. And in many ways, the Turks have felt validated and as a result of the downturn of events in Iraq. So when you look at kind of America's strategic focus, it's clear to me that Turkey is becoming increasingly more important, not necessarily because of anything Turkey is doing, but because of what's gone on in the world for America. When we look at Afghanistan, when we look at Turkey, when we look at Iran, when we look at the Arab-Israeli peace conflict, peace process, it's clear that Turkey has a vital role here. And the bottom line is that Turkey also has been changing. Since 2002, when the AKP has come to power, whether you like them or not, you have to give them credit. They have helped the economic growth in an unprecedented manner. They've kind of reasserted a sense of Turkish pride. I like to say anybody who studied Turkey for a while, you see in Turkey in extremes. You're either watching Turkey that's completely depressed about life, we have no power, we can't do anything, or you're seeing a completely self-confident Turkey. We clearly are seeing a self-confident Turkey. I would even warn that what we're seeing in the Prime Minister's current behavior might even border on arrogance because of the language he's using. And I think that one of the important factors to pay attention to is, are we looking at rhetoric or are we looking at action? In this town, in the recent days, particularly since the Flotilla incident, the language of the Prime Minister has dominated the headlines. What I would point to is, what is the actual actions? Turkey has not cut off its relations with Israel, despite the fact that 9 of its citizens were killed in international waters. Turkey has continued to dialogue with Israel. Just today or recently, the foreign minister of Turkey had a meeting with the trade minister from Israel. There was discussion going on, so clearly that relationship is not dead. And to kind of prematurely say that Turkey-Israel relations are dead is premature. I think that that's not the case. There's no denying that there's a trouble in the relationship. Clearly, in the past, Turkey was always working with Israel. They had a strategic alliance in the 90s, but I would argue that alliance was in and of itself kind of untenable. As long as Syria was supporting the PKK in terms of national terrorists in Turkey, they were going to continue to squeeze Syria, and one of the best ways to do that was through Israel. Now that that period has changed in terms of Syria becoming one of Turkey's closest partners economically and looking at the strategic vision of the Middle East since the kind of the collapse of Iraq, Israel is now being conditioned by Turkey. There's an indexation in some ways of whether Turkey has good relations with Israel based on its peace process. And so given the current composition of the Israeli government, the Turks don't believe that there's a real peace process in place, and therefore they're going to put more pressure. And what we saw with the Gaza blockade flotilla incident, and what we saw in Davos. Prior to the Davos incident, this government was directly involved in peace negotiations between the Israelis and Syrians. So to say that, oh, it's all ideological and it's the AKP that hates Jews as anti-Semitic, there is an element of that. I'm not denying it. There is ideology here. But the bottom line is strategic interest in Turkey's case in terms of economic prowess. As it looks at the Middle East, it wants to have a stable market for its goods. So I would argue that whether it's the AKP or any other government, the nationalist kind of populist sentiment in Turkey is pushing in one direction. Now that's in terms of actions. The rhetoric, on the other hand, is concerning to me. Turkey is clearly beginning to feel very self-confident. It feels like it has a seat at the table. Indeed, it should have a seat at the table. It's a founding member of G20. It's on the UN National Security Council for the first time in many years. It's a EU aspirant country. As the head of the Organization of Islamic Conference States, it's an important player. And for the United States or the West or anybody to treat Turkey without the deference that it deserves is always going to cause a reaction. Now, whether or not the actions of the rhetoric has gone too far and maybe they are projecting themselves more than their capabilities, that's something we can have for discussion. But I just wanted to put out some of those highlights. The last point that I wanted to make in terms of when we talk about Turkey in this town and when we think about Turkey as a strategic ally, I want to point out the fact that not much has changed. Turkey still represents, in my opinion, the best ally of the United States in the region. Now, I don't mean best in the sense that it is going to always do what we want them to do. During the Cold War, that was the way in which we judged our allies. You're either with us or you're against us. You either do what we ask you to do or you don't do it. Nowadays, it's become much more kind of a back and forth. I think that America and Turkey have a fundamentally identical view of the Middle East in terms of what it looks like. I don't mean identical in the sense that we're always going to get to the same, we're going to have the same means to get to the same ends. But I think our ends are fundamentally the same. What does Turkey want in the Middle East? It wants a stable, prosperous Middle East that has a two-state solution in Israel and sees a non-nuclear Iran. Despite all the rhetoric, despite the UN Security Council vote that caught many people off guard, what the Turks are saying and what the Turks are pushing for is an engagement of the Iranians, something that the Americans have been unwilling to do for over the past 30 years. And it's clear to me that with the Obama administration, its own domestic politics, it has to continually push forward. I don't necessarily think that the Obama administration and Turkey are at odds today. I think that there's a deep resentment. I think there's a mistrust on the part of both the Turks sometimes and on the part of the administration of what Turkey's doing. And I think that has more to do with miscommunication than it has to do with actual policy. And so when we come to the question of who can America work with in the Middle East, clearly to me, when you look at the vision of what Israel has for the Middle East with its current government and what Iran has in terms of what it likes to see in the Middle East, those are not things that America seems to be all that interested in pursuing in terms of a greater Israel project or a greater Iranian empire or a Shia-led bloc of some sort. Turkey doesn't have that interest. I think Turks are very much driven by their pocketbooks. Turks are very much driven by their business. They're the largest construction companies, the largest investments. Anywhere you travel in the Middle East, you see the rise of soft power in Turkey. The soap operas of Turkey have dominated the headlines throughout the Arab world. And when you look at the way in which the neighbors of Turkey are looking towards Turkey, there is no longer this sense of kind of, oh, they're the Trojan horse of the Americans. There's a real sense of, wow, Turkey has emerged on this stage. They're able to say no to America. They're able to really work with America. And I think it's important for Turks to understand that the self-confidence that they have is a good thing, first and foremost. We're not scared of it in Washington. But second, that self-confidence comes from its anchor in the West. If Turkey decides to break off its relationship with the West and decides that it wants to kind of have no relationship with America and criticize America all the time or criticize the Europeans, this is going to cause trouble, because the reason Turkey is such an important interlocutor is because it has relations with everybody. It has relations with the West, it has relations with Iran, it has relations with Israelis, with Arabs, I can go on. But I think it's important to understand these kind of geostrategic factors, and that's what the report tries to lay out. So hopefully we can get into more of these controversial issues later, but I just wanted to kind of lay that out from my perspective. Thank you.
Well, thank you. So?
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to try to complement a little bit what Joshua has been saying by taking a more European perspective on things, because the EU is still kind of in this triangular relationship between Turkey, the US, the EU, an important partner. And I think it's important also to understand how they frame the issue in a very different ways to kind of see kind of the alternative ways of looking at Turkey. In many ways, I would like to start with kind of the way the debates have been shaped in Europe in the last months or so, because it is in many ways much less kind of radical than the way it has been, especially here in DC, but in the US more in general. And whereas here we almost have seen kind of a, 2 months ago Turkey was this very great ally and everything was fine, and suddenly it has completely shifted and become kind of almost an enemy and something we really should be worried about. The debates in Europe are much more nuanced and much more complex. Like it is based, of course, on the fact that we are talking about 27 countries, so they all have a slightly different perspective, but also because their worldview, they are less interested in strategic issues and more kind of dealing with a larger range of issues, and so they have kind of a more complex understanding of what the world is about. And so in a way, for Europe, there has been less of a shift in terms of what Turkey means. Turkey used to be, not so good, not so bad, kind of in between depending on the issues, and it is still so now. So this is kind of, I think, interesting to understand in that context. I would like to talk about two main things. One is kind of, and I'll do that in a second part, but look at the broader nature of the EU project and how Turkey kind of fits in this project. But also first look at more kind of the characteristics of individual EU countries and how the debate has been done on Turkey in these countries. So as I said, it's very difficult to kind of portray what the EU think about Turkey, because we're talking about 27 countries that have very different interests. But what is very interesting to see is the way they think about Turkey is always through the lens of what is going to happen once Turkey is in the EU. And does it mean that I'm going to lose power or gain power institutionally? Is Turkey going to side with me on some of the important issues I'm interested in? And so yeah, this is a lot of kind of not thinking so much of Turkey strategically in its region, but more once in the EU, how would my own position in the EU change regarding this? And of course, when we talk about the EU, and especially in its relation with Turkey, there are two main countries that are really more important, and the two ones I can also talk about a little bit more, which are France and Germany, for very different reasons. And even more in the case of Germany, you can see how the issue of Turkey is very much a domestic issue. And especially in Germany, this is very much linked to the issue of immigration and the 3 million or more Turkish immigrants in Germany. And how basically it is tying Germany in having a very ambiguous positions towards Turkey, both because in a way they cannot really say no and kind of slap the door to Turkey, because if Turkey is defined as being outside of the EU, it's going to create a big problem for the Turkish minority in Germany, because it will kind of suddenly mean, okay, we said no to Turkey because we thought it was not European. What does this mean for the 3 million immigrants we have inside? So in a way, Germany cannot be really, have too much of a distance with Turkey. At the same time, they really look at Turkey's domestic and kind of foreign policies through the lens of, we have this, we have a Turkey which is suddenly very much, interested in business and kind of having initiatives, and this reminds us of the Turks at home who are also kind of very active in the economy and doing good things. Or then we're going to have another event, and it's going to be, we have this prime minister who suddenly has this kind of Islamist line, or this reminds us of our communities, which are also kind of really conservative and religious. And so everything is read a little bit through this lens, which kind of change a lot the debate on how it is. So there is a feeling that whatever Turkey is doing is going to exacerbate these good or bad issues at home in Germany later on. In France, the debate is a little bit even more interesting, I think. There is, and this was a line I kind of discovered recently, but this was very preponderant. I was in France just 2 weeks ago, and every people I met with, this was kind of the line that kept coming and coming, especially when talking about, we know what kind of the position of France, especially since Sarkozy is the president. There is a very clear policy of, we don't want Turkey in the EU, we want a strategic partnership, but we don't talk about it right now because we are not even close to getting there, so we're just kind of delaying, postponing talking about this issue. But regarding kind of France, kind of officials' reaction towards what Turkey has been doing with the Flotilla incidents, with the Iran no vote, there has been really this line that I found a little bit amusing in a way, of France that does not really have a problem with the substance of what Turkey is doing. The problem is more one of competition, and there is this fear that Turkey is going to replace France and the role that France is playing in the Middle East, which is a very, I think, absurd and illogical way of looking at things. But there is a little bit this idea that, and this kind of goes back to, who is gaining more power within the EU or more in general in the region. And there is this feeling of competition which is kind of very strong in France. But on all these issues, as I stated before, the EU doesn't really look at Turkey as kind of a strategic foreign policy issue. They really look at it, once Turkey is going to be inside of the EU, what type of decision? I mean, if Turkey differs fundamentally on some of the decision, how are we going to be able to have this kind of coherent European foreign policy? So the big question, I think, for Europe that needs to be, and this is what we did also into the report, is to what extent is really Turkish foreign policy and Turkish behavior in general compatible or not with this kind of the broader EU project and the kind of values that it has been trying to project in its neighborhood. And so this kind of leads us to look not so much at kind of the events that kind of make the headline, but look at the more kind of structural underpinnings of why Turkey is having this more active foreign policy in the region. And what we find in the report is that in many ways, Turkish foreign policy is rather compatible with European foreign policy. It's actually even in a way doing kind of the European neighborhood policy that the EU has been trying to do, not so successfully, but in a way Turkey is doing that in a more active and on some issues in a more successful way. And what I mean here is that really kind of the socio-economic forces that are kind of at the core, the motor of this new Turkish activism is the region, is all about the rise of civil society, the rise of business community. We keep talking about these Anatolian tigers and how they kind of have grown within Turkey, but it started to spill over in terms of interest and kind of opening markets more in the region. Civil society is also increasingly active in having like combined projects in the neighborhood. And so this is, in a way, part of this democratization of you have more and more actors. It's not only now the army and the foreign ministry who is deciding on foreign policy. You have a much broader part of the Turkish society which is having a stake in this and which is pushing Turkey to open to the neighborhood. One of the reasons why it is pushing Turkey to open to the neighborhood, especially on the side of the business community, is that it is increasing. It is in a way difficult for Turkey to access European markets. There is a custom unions. So technically it should not be difficult, but because of the visa policy, the Schengen visa policy, which makes it rather difficult for Turkish people to come to Europe, it is not a problem for like big enterprise who have connection and can get the visa. But for kind of the small or medium, entrepreneurs, they have some product that they could maybe sell in Germany or in Austria or somewhere. They can only stand it and try to sell. They cannot kind of come with the product and try to sell it together. And because of this frustration, this has led to a pressure on the Turkish government to, well, since we cannot do that really easily in Europe, let's at least try to open to the Middle East, to the Black Sea, which is economically less promising. I mean, it is promising, but in the short term, it is not as rich and active as Europe is. But at least it is something we can do now and start develop even more our business. And so not only this, but just the very idea of the zero problem policy of trying to have a more open kind of cooperative relation with all of the neighbors. The whole idea of opening the borders and lifting visa, which is in the last year or so, it is incredible how much the Turkish government has reached visa-free agreement with many of the neighbors, not only neighbors. There was recently an agreement with Indonesia, but it has reached agreements with Russia, which was a very huge agreement, with Syria as well, which used to be an enemy not so long ago, and suddenly we have like open borders and everything is fine. And the whole talks in general about this kind of Middle Eastern Union, which it's unclear how much it's going to go, but kind of the idea behind this is, we're going to open border, we're going to cooperate, and this is going to, create more prosperity in the region, which is going to spill over into stability and less conflict. And this is a very European idea in a way. This is all what the EU was about, after World War II, kind of creating this new open space of cooperating and then trying to avoid the big wars that we had before. So in terms of really the substance and kind of the more structural thing that Turkey is doing, it is in a way very much compatible with the EU. Now, there are other problems that the EU has to deal with first, especially the economic crisis now. So there is some good reasons for them not to be so interested in Turkey right now. But at least I think it is important to have an understanding that things, if you look kind of a little bit deeper than really just what is making the headline, what Turkey is doing is actually not too bad. Yet there is a big problem, and this is what I think Joshua was already mentioning. There is this big risk of populism, and when again a confident Turkey is great. An overconfident Turkey that goes over the top on some of the issues is a little bit worrisome. And this is where, again, kind of having the Western anchor in general, but especially the EU anchor, which is encouraging a lot of reforms at home and kind of, putting some types of framework on how policies is done, is very important. And in that sense, there is a very kind of mutually reinforcing relationship between both the EU and Turkey. And it can be a mutually reinforcing, but it can also be a mutually weakening thing. So if the EU starts not looking at Turkey, Turkey will start not looking at the EU and going to different direction. But if there is a mutual interest, it can really reinforce, and it's something that's really gonna be at the advantage of both sides. And I'm going to stop now because I would like to.
Well, thank you. Those are terrific presentations. And you know that in events of this kind, the moderator usually takes the privilege of asking the first question. And what that really means is that they're afraid that if they don't ask the first question, they're not seen as doing their job. So it's more like an obligation. Sometimes you prefer let's just ask the audience. So let me ask the first question here. And actually, I have been doing a fair amount of research lately on European Muslim minorities and the relationship between majority communities and government, and this is probably the most controversial and an important issue from an European social perspective. I mean, this is what the Europeans talk about all the time. And I believe that the obstacles to Turkey's accession to the EU are really not driven by state-level factors. I mean, it's true that there are factors over changes of the balance of power within the EU and all of that, but I think it's really driven by cultural and social considerations. And I can't help noticing that that Turkey was a candidate for EU membership long before the East European countries came on the scene. And now we see that the former, members of the Warsaw Pact are all in the EU, but not all of them, but most of them, and not Turkey. The reality is that was blocking Turkey's entrance into the EU is a suspicion on the part of some sectors of European public opinion that Turkey is really not European, even though, as a matter of fact, Turkey has been part of the European system of states at least since the Middle or late Ottoman period. So, again, my question is, I don't think these factors are going to change. And in fact, there seems to be increasing xenophobia in Europe. And we see, for example, the Swiss ban on minarets, the French proposal to ban the burqa, and all of this is a reaction. The very good showing of the anti-immigration parties in the Netherlands, and there is an anti-immigration party that's now part of the Danish government. So we have all of these reactions going on. And my question is that even though, objectively speaking, you could say that Turkish foreign policy is compatible with European foreign policy, whether the appearance of turning to the East, of a more Islamic emphasis within in Turkish foreign policy, not just in Turkish foreign policy, but in attitudes. You see the pro-Hamas demonstrations in Istanbul, for example. Whether this is not reinforcing these negative perceptions in Europe that might again create greater hindrances to what, in the end, I think we all believe to be a necessity, which is Turkey's entrance into the European Union. And what, if anything, could be done about it? That's a tough question, but there you have it.
I'll let you start.
Yes.
Yeah, that's indeed a tough question. Well, on general, the question of immigration, and especially Muslim immigration in Europe, I would definitely define it as one of the top issue for Europe, and one that Europe is actually not doing as bad as it sounds, because there are a lot of success, but kind of what is being covered in the media and kind of the fears that are really expressed on a daily basis it is very, 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 very worrisome issue on that. I would actually argue, but this is maybe something I could talk later, that Turkey can actually help Europe deal with this, but this is a slightly different issue. The idea that these issues are kind of one of the main obstacles of Turkish accession to the EU is, I think, true, but only for certain countries. It is mainly true for Germany, the Netherlands, Austria, maybe France, maybe Italy. But we are talking about here 5 or 6 countries, and the EU is about 27 countries, and the other countries don't really have this view, this same problem with migration, or at least they don't tie it so directly with this issue of Turkey. So I think it is important to see it, but it's not a completely EU-wide problem. It's actually more restricted to a couple of countries, even though they tend to be the most important one. Which all lead to this whole idea to, is Turkey really European or not? And are there kind of this objective criteria that would help us decide if Turkey is culturally European or not? And I think this is a little bit of a wrong question, because culture is not kind of is not something fixed in time. Like there are a lot of arguments to argue that Turkey is European. There are a couple of arguments also to argue that it is not European. This is not so much a matter of what it is. It's more a matter of choice. Does Europe want to be the type of Europe which is inclusive and doesn't have kind of a close understanding of identity, which actually is kind of the same, kind of close nationalist understanding of identity that created some problem not so long ago in Europe? Or does it want to be this more inclusive, not so much cultural project, but more kind of a, political and based on values, and this is really a choice that is going to be made. The main problem, especially in those countries we are talking about, is leaders tend to not really play the roles of leaders. They tend to just follow a public opinion, which is really worried, especially in times of economic crisis. The first scapegoats become the immigrants, and leaders are just capitalizing on that instead of trying to shaping public opinion in a much more positive and better way. To what extent is current Turkish policy kind of reinforcing those stereotypes? I think it is to some extent, but not in a very simplistic way. Like, for instance, the whole Flotilla incident created a huge amount of popularity in Europe about Turkey, because in Europe, not depending on the countries, but you tend to have a public opinion which is really pro-Palestinian. And the whole incident was really seen as kind of Israel attacking this kind of civil society people that in Europe we tend to see as this very peaceful and nice and humanitarian people. And in that sense, I mean, maybe some of the images of protest in Turkey, especially of people like veiled people with like the Hamas banners and everything, may have created some worries in some circles. But I think overall the Flotilla incident actually was quite creating more popularity at the public opinion level in Europe. But it is true that some of the statements that have been done by officials in Turkey, including the Prime Minister, that seems to not be completely balanced regarding, seems to be a little bit more Islamist in the sense that it is less harsh on Muslims than it is on non-Muslims. Might have a negative impact. And I think not only for Turkey-EU relation, but for Turkey itself, it's something that the government should be really wary of and be more cautious.
Yeah. Joshua, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to add one thing before we turn it over and get some good questions. Your last point about the perception versus reality, that's the crux of the matter. I mean, I wonder, when you look at a country like France, during the Cold War, it had a very different policy sometimes. Or a country like Germany, its Ostpolitik, idea of kind of engaging the Soviets as opposed to opposing them. We never questioned their fundamental identity. It was never that they were not Western or not European. It was that they had a divergence of interest. They had different economic interests, they had different things. How can we overcome that? So to me, as a policymaker, it seems to be the questions that are being asked in terms of, oh my gosh, what's happening? Are they switching? Are they becoming Muslim or Islamist? Are distracting us from the real issues. What are the real interests in Turkey? What are the primary drivers when it comes to Turkey's Iran policy, for example, right? Well, it's very easy to look at. Sanctions are bad for Turkey, because the country that gets hurt the most besides Iran is Turkey. So when you take the question and you make it into an identity politic one, which is absolutely, I agree with you 100%, it becomes about perception. Now, how do you fight this? Because the reality is that if I were to take a bet, am I more worried about Turkey becoming the Islamic Republic of Turkey like Iran, or more like Venezuela and Russia? I'm much more scared about Turkey looks more like a Russia or Venezuela. The Prime Minister, in his behavior in recent days, and the way in which he's behaving among his party, and the way he we don't know what's going to happen next, right? There could be a new constitution in which the presidency gets more power, and then there's a situation where you have like a Putin-Medvedev situation. I mean, that looks more likely to me than the Islamist Turkey. I mean, anybody who's been to Turkey sees very clearly that the Turks like the rakı. You're not going to take the rakı away. That's an alcoholic beverage. You're not going to be able to convince people to become a certain version of Islam. I mean, Islam is a part of the culture in Turkey, but the Turkish version of what it means to be Muslim in terms of modernity and tradition is not interpreted in the same way that it is in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else. This is a real democracy with all the problems that it has. And a real democracy, like Juliette is pointing to, the problems are about populism and nationalism. That to me scares me when it comes to Russia, because Russia has an elected government too. And they have a more authoritarian style. To me, that's scarier. But when I hear in Washington and in Europe, Europe's actually worse about it. And I would say the European experience of focusing on culture makes it a lot easier to scapegoat Turkey as kind of the Muslim other. As opposed to the US, we kind of look at things from a more ahistorical point of view, and we're like, okay, well, what can we do about this? What are the actual issues? So, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. That is the real issue. So that's what I would add.
Well, thank you. So let's open now the floor for discussion. Please identify yourself when you ask a question, and then address it to the particular speaker. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Tanyel Kushakjan from the Armenian Assembly of America. Thank you both, Juliette and Joshua, for your competent analysis and presentations. You started by opening up and stating the inevitable Armenian genocide resolutions. As you know, support for the resolution in the House has grown over the last month, and we hear that Senator Kerry, Chairman Kerry, is poised to mark up the Senate version anytime soon. And you know, with the Armenia-initiated protocols that Turkey has stalled on ratifying, my question is to the presenters. Isn't it in everyone's best interest, long-term, U.S., Turkey, and Armenia, that Turkey acknowledge the genocide and open the border? Otherwise, zero problems with zero neighbors will never be successful.
I'll take a first crack at it, given the American component there. Look, what happened in 1915 is tragic, whatever you want to call it. You know, I happen to personally think that it probably fits the definition of genocide. But there are many Turks that feel the exact same way. But what I don't like is the political ramifications of what that means. I don't really feel like I should be dictating to some other country what their history is. And so therefore I don't think that the Congress or the Senate is a place for that to happen. The fact is, for domestic political reasons, that's going to go through. I actually think, I mean, honestly, when I talk to my Turkish friends, my feeling is, why don't you get ahead of this? Admit it. Basically say, look, what happened in 1950 was a tragedy. Lots of people died. If you want to call it a genocide, we're okay with that. We're not going to call it a genocide. We have different ways of looking at history. That's fine. And the real hope was the protocols that you talked about. And to me, what's disturbing is not necessarily that the domestic lobby and that this is a big issue for Armenian Americans or all Armenians around the world. This is an identity issue for anybody from that group. I happen to not be from that group, but I'm sympathetic and I understand that perspective. But from a Turkish point of view, it seems to me that the stalling of the protocols is an absolute disaster, because that has given the enemies within the Turkish government an excuse and the nationalists to come back. I mean, the AKP took a real chance here in terms of trying to engage. Absolutely. And the Armenian president got hit pretty hard when he came here. The Armenian Americans, from my understanding, were not happy with the historic steps. But what's interesting is I don't think this process is dead. I'm not as pessimistic. When I read the statement from the Armenian side saying that the protocols were dead, or that they're in a deep freeze, it was very clear. They congratulated President Gül. Very interesting that they personally called out the president. And I think that's important to notice. I think that when you look at the domestic Turkish polity, I think that President Gül has been most out in front here. Erdogan seems to not be as committed to this because he's the one that deals with the political ramifications. So to me, there is room here. The issue is, can Turkey on a domestic level consume this? And from my perspective, a genocide resolution, we know what that's going to do in terms of Turks going absolutely berserk over this issue. So to me, you know, I mean, whether or not that's facts or truth or whatever, if that is, to me it's like I don't want to see that happen because it would be disastrous for U.S.-Turkish relations. But given the incidents that we've had in the last couple of weeks, my sense is many of Turkey's greatest allies and biggest friends that have kept this from getting to where it goes are going to withdraw their support. And if Senator Kerry or Nancy Pelosi bring this back, as they both have indicated, I'm pretty sure it's going to pass. And so now my defensive mechanism is, okay, how do we deal with the ramifications with the Turks? And the easiest way to deal with that is to say, look, what difference does it make to you guys? It's a resolution. Like, there are resolutions passed everywhere. We've condemned our own genocide against the Indians, slavery. I mean, my state in Virginia, we have these resolutions all the time. So the Turks actually make it a much bigger issue than it is. I don't know what you want to add.
Yeah, the only thing I totally agree with Joshua. The only thing I would like to add is Turkey has been changing quite fast in the last 10 years. And I remember the first time I went there 10 years ago, there were some really big taboo issues, and one of them was the Armenian issues, the other one was the Kurdish issues. Now, you could not talk about this without people getting crazy. Now it's not the case anymore. And I mean, this is quite amazing, because you had like 85 years of very kind of strong state ideology that was basically much just hiding those issues. And suddenly there has been an opening. And I think it's just important to recognize that, and also, it's going to take time. It's not so easy, given how it is really linked to how people have been raised, and it's very kind of internalized in terms of the identity and everything. So it's going to take time to change. And I think there will also need to be some form of be it kind of a historical research or some type of discussions really between the Armenian side and the Turkish side to really kind of find a way of defining it which is really acceptable for both sides.
Can I get a follow-up from Josh real quick? You said made a statement about the U.S. dictating another person's history. How do you feel about a foreign country dictating American foreign policy?
I'm confused.
Well, with the Turkish lobby's efforts to squash any mention of the Armenian genocide, whether it's the State Department ambassador saying the words Armenian genocide, or just the reference, as you said, it's a symbolic resolution that has no legal binding, and that seems to be prevented every year by a foreign country. And so, as an American, I'm quite upset that a foreign government can...
I mean, look, as both Americans, we can agree on the fact that our political process is an open one, and for good and for bad. So the number of lobbyists running around town who take foreign money, I mean, I could point my finger at every single country in the world. I mean, so of course the Turks are going to do that, because they know, I mean, what's amazing to me is that the Turks took so long to figure out the game, right? Up until this point, they've been hiring people that are not themselves to do this for them. Now they're actually belatedly coming to Washington themselves and trying to change the posture. I mean, to me, what I would, if I was to give advice to the Turkish government on how to fight the genocide resolution, I would not take the tack they've been taking. What I would take the tack is to try to increase the Turkish American population and their interest here. I mean, if you want to fight this, you've got to raise the money. You've got to be able to get your voice out there. You know, I mean, what I find fascinating is it's not just a national issue, right? Every state is going through different things. So if you're from California and you look at the way that history is taught there and mandated, and you look at different states that are passing different types of resolutions, that's a much more interesting tactic in some ways. Whereas the Turks don't even focus on that. They're only focused on one thing. And I think their obsession on that one issue has wasted a lot of time and energy on their part. So for me, I'm kind of like, it's a free-for-all. Why don't you get a resolution that talks about how Turkey's great and it's an open dialogue country? Like, forget about make another resolution. Don't worry about that resolution. Make a different resolution. If it's not that important to you, if it shouldn't be that important to you, it has nothing to do with you, because it was the Ottomans after all, right? I mean, to me, the easiest tact is to say, look, that happened 100 years ago. I didn't have any culpability. Let me just reject the empire that we've been rejecting for the last 100 years and move on.
Let me just make a comment to close this this discussion. I'm actually less less sanguine than you are about the possibility of limiting the damage, because as everybody knows, most people in this room know, the Armenian genocide issue is a neuralgic issue in Turkey. It's not a matter of a Kemalist ideology. It lives across the spectrum. And I have seen people on the AKP side who are just as upset as people on the secularist side. I think it's across the board. I don't think that Turks would agree, and I would defer to a Turk on this issue, but I don't think they would agree that this is something that the Ottomans did, because Turkey is the successor state to the Ottoman Empire. So it's not going to be easy, and I don't think that it's going to be that simple to try to limit the damage that to Turkish-American relations that passage of an Armenian genocide resolution would cause. Having said that, and by the way, some of the recommendations that you made now, I recall, were being made back in the 1980s, when the Turks were told, well, yes, you need to build your own organizations that they could counter the other side. And in fact, in those days, Jewish American organizations were very active in helping the Turks to develop their own lobbying on the Hill. The unfortunate fallout from the Flotilla incident with regard to this particular issue is that now, as you mentioned, some of Turkey's strongest proponents in the past have withdrawn support. So it'll be very, very difficult to prevent passage of a resolution. I think it would be incumbent on both governments, on the State Department and their counterparts in Turkey, to have some contingency plans to deal with this, and to try to the extent possible, limit the fallout. But that's, I think, the best that can be done.
Yeah. Thank you.
Stuart, you please identify yourself. And
Stuart Schwartzstein, Transatlantic Dialogue on Broadcasting. You both talked about change. Could you both talk about demographic change in Turkey, which I assume has been considerable?
Why don't you go first?
Sure. I'm not sure exactly in what context you're thinking about it, but
population growth rate,
yeah,
urbanization, the structure of the population, all of which, the ethnic composition, Kurdish versus Turkish, and there's undoubtedly have been significant changes over the last few decades.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is one of the things kind of that kind of came together with all this kind of internal social change that happened. Indeed, kind of both the growth of the population, the internal migration, which has been quite radical in many ways, of basically a migration from small cities to villages to cities, and from small cities to bigger cities, and usually in a movement that went to the west of the countries, as really kind of transformed the society in terms of like political powers, and how it has been changed in terms of the electorates now in big cities like Istanbul are not the same type of people that you used to have. In terms of kind of the economic elites that have been changing, this is part of this kind of Anatolian tigers, and how now there is this kind of counter elite that is not the traditional kind of white Turk Kemalist elites. Now we have a different type of elite, which is a little bit more conservative, but also very active in the economic realm, and this has had a lot of impact internally on kind of the structure of the political system, and especially, I mean, this is one of the reasons also why AKP was so successful and is still successful in the last 8 years, and so it has had kind of a trickle-down effect also on foreign policy, and because this has kind of given more voice in a way to more conservative people in Turkey in general.
Just one thing I would add to that, when I look at the demographic changes on a broader regional scale, and you look at kind of the unemployment rates in the region, and the constant kind of youth bulge you see in the Middle East versus the old kind of, the graying of Europe, there's clearly, if Europe is going to continue to have the level and quality of life that it wants, it's going to have to get immigration from somewhere. And when I look at kind of Turkey, and I look at the education there, and I look at the entrepreneurship that's demonstrated, I mean, the Turkish business folks that we're talking about, the people who go to school, and the levels of students that are going to college and university in Turkey, and the high level of education in terms of the top universities in Turkey are all in English. I mean, they're very well suited for the European market, and not to mention the American market. So, if I'm looking at where I want to get a kind of have a good investment opportunity and be able to bring in a crop of very, high energy, highly educated group of people, Turkey is the fit there. And I think that Turkey knows that. And I think one of the reasons that you see such a self-confidence within the Prime Minister and his party is because they were the ones that kind of rode this wave in the same way that Obama was able to change the political calculation in this country by bringing in a new generation in some ways. You see that same type of feeling among the AKP and the way in which they do it. I would also add that the way they do politics looks very much like the way we do it here in this country, because many of their top pollsters and politicians come from education in this country, and so the way they do politics in terms of creating a grassroots movement, I really wouldn't look at the AKP like any other party in Turkey. The constituency base is based very much on its grassroots movement, and it looks at kind of the demographic changes and actually studies that to understand how to get votes from the areas that may be on the losing end of urbanization, the losing end on globalization. But that also leads back to the point we've reiterated, which is there's a real danger of populism in Turkey because of that very factor.
Do you happen to know offhand population growth rate?
I know that the projection is that currently Turkey is at 72 or 73 million, and that by 2015 that's supposed to be up to 80 in the 85 range. So I mean that's a I don't know what that's a significant increase.
It is still going pretty fast, but it is expected that within 10 or 15 years there will be a slowing down of the growing, and like because more and more families, settle down with 1 or 2 children. Yeah. So it is going to slow down in the next 20 years.
Go ahead.
Hello, Abdurrahman Babajan from SETA DC. Thanks for your presentation. Both of you have talked about the biggest problem, the biggest risk is increasing populism, ultranationalism, Euroscepticism, and anti-Americanism, and also I can add pan-Islamism maybe in internal politics of Turkey. But there are 2 factors related with them, as I guess. Firstly, taking within the context of identity of Turkey, talking within the context of philosophy and also civilizational-based culture, and also history from Turkish perspective. The other one is strategic concerns, such as contradicting perceptions and perspectives to the issues, such as combating with the terrorism, such as PKK, and the attitudes and manners of US and EU toward the such issue. And so that if the events developed in such a manner that reinforce mutually each other, I think I wonder whether you agree with me there is a lack of depth vision both for US and EU in seeing Turkey in both those factors all. Do you agree with me, or what do you think?
So I'm trying to figure out exactly what you were laying out. Let me paraphrase and see if I get it. Basically, the way in which America is looking at Turkey doesn't fit the Turkish mindset. Is that, yeah. So just to expand a little bit for those who might not be as well versed in Turkey, I think that the narrative in Turkey has shifted from kind of being a small kind of nation state that's on the edge of Europe that's fighting against the Soviets to being a central power. In other words, Turkey is now not only just about Turkey, it goes back to the Ottoman legacy. The Turks were in, over 30 successor states. It's a real power, and Turkey should be consulted. Turkey should sit at the table. You can't tell Turkey what to do anymore. And I think that fits generally, and you're right. Many of our European and American friends don't realize this yet. Now, to be fair, I don't think that Americans ever really acted that way, even though the Bush administration gave us a bad name in terms of being kind of a cowboy diplomacy in which he told people what to do. This administration came out with open hands. And I think one of the more significant factors that's overlooked a lot in Turkey is the fact that Obama went to Turkey for the first visit of his bilateral visit. And the public opinion, the changing perceptions didn't change. I mean, it's amazing. The Transatlantic Trends Survey that the German Marshall Fund does showed this increase of unbelievable proportion in Europe, where there was called the Obama bounce, right? In France and Germany, et cetera. In Turkey, it didn't happen. And many people ask us, what is going on? What's wrong with that country? Are you guys, is there something wrong with Turks? And I say, well, yes, there is a lot of things wrong with Turks, just like there's a lot of things wrong with Americans. Turks really do honestly believe there is no friend of a Turk except himself. That mentality has to change, right? And I think that one of this factor that you have is kind of these unique features in the Turkish-American relationship. And the PKK and the nationalist kind of Kurdish movement is the biggest one. The fact is the Kurds are the largest people group without a state, right? Turkey has the largest number of Kurds in it. Until that problem, that issue is resolved in a democratic manner, it seems to me that Turkey's always going to have trouble in the outside world. Because anytime Turkey criticizes any other country, the first thing they do, I mean, look what happened with Israel. Turkey said that you guys are committing genocide against the Palestinians. What did Israel say? They said, don't lecture us about genocide, referencing what our friend mentioned earlier. The second thing is, look at the way you treat the Kurds. That's really difficult, right? And I think what's great about what's happening in Turkey today that Juliette has been referencing and I have as well, is there's a change. There's a feeling among the Turks that they are confident enough to admit their problems. To say, yes, we have problems, but you have problems too. If you want to work with us, let's find common interests. Let's work on this together. I agree with you. Looking at Turkey through this civilizational paradigm of kind of you're either with us or against us, Huntington's Clash of Civilization, is exactly the wrong perspective. We need to look at Turkey as a partner. What can we work together on? America has a lot to offer Turkey, and this idea that kind of Turkey would be better off without the EU and doesn't even need America because it's got all these great new friends in the Middle East is very short-sighted, and I think that's very dangerous in some ways. The second point I would make is when Juliette was talking about the EU process and the difficulties, the bottom line is we've never seen anything quite like this. The EU process has come to a standstill. In other words, it's still going on, great, but the problem is America's having problems with Turkey at the same time. In the past, anytime there was problems with the EU, America would help patch things up. Anytime there was a problem with America, the European Union would help us with things. Now Turkey's in a position where both are going in a pretty bad direction. And yes, there's a lot of blame to be had in Washington for this. I've written many times myself about the tendency in Washington to demonize Turkey without understanding what's happening in Turkey. So I think it's incumbent on all of us, both within this country and in Turkey, to try to help kind of cool and balance heads to prevail and kind of ratchet down the rhetoric and ratchet down the position of politicians who get to the point where now you have to apologize to me, otherwise I can't talk to you. That's not a good place to be. We need to be able to have discussions and to be able to use the institutional links that exist.
Juliette, do you have any thoughts on this?
I think another aspect of the question was a little bit about, Turkey used to have a discourse saying that, we're Western, we are modernized, we are kind of on the same path as Europe and the West, and because of that you should accept us, we should be part of the thing. Now it has changed a little bit. It is not so much of, we did the modernization and everything exactly the same as Europe. It is more kind of grounding a little bit more, we have our own history, we have our own kind of tradition, we have our own values that have incorporated a lot of the kind of Western modernization process, but we also have something more that, not all countries have. And this is something that I think Turkey is thinking a lot about, and I think it is something that it can bring a lot into the international arena in general and in relation with the West. The problem is the West, I think as you were mentioning, the EU and the US doesn't see that, and still kind of wants to see Turkey, is it behaving exactly like us for the same reason as we do? Instead of looking at it as a as a separate partner, which has its own characteristic, its own deficiencies, but also its own value added. This is something that you might not have in you, and you might be able. And I think this is where Turkey needs, and it is already, it has improved already a lot, but needs to do a better job at trying to explain and kind of repeat and repeat again why there are those kind of different background they are coming with, and why this can be a potential. Why maybe sometimes it's not going to be enough. It's not going to be it alone, it might not be enough. But the whole, I'm thinking about this, especially on the whole Iran issue and the sanction and the vote and the agreement they made with Brazil. I think there was a little bit the idea of, because kind of culturally and historically we are, used to deal with Iran, we can bring, something special that the Westerners that were really kind of at the opposite side from Iran could not really dialogue in the same way. And I think this was something positive that could have worked. It failed, though, to kind of convince the EU and the US that there was something here that was valuable. It might not have been enough, because indeed, that Iran is playing around. And kind of in the last 30 years, the EU and the US has more experience in dealing with Iran. So there must have been a closer cooperation between the two sides. But I think there is something here that Turkey can really bring to the table, and need to explain better why it is the case.
Yes. Next question. Let's see the lady back there.
Camille Ice with the Truman National Security Project. You've been talking, Josh made the point about how there's been all this debate about identities and who is Turkey with, and you're arguing that it's more about strategic interests. And in the case of the Middle East, I was curious if you could speak a little bit about whether Turkey has a strategic interest in more open societies in the Middle East, and whether these closer relations with Middle Eastern countries and this new policy of zero problems with neighbors and all of that will yield any results there. What do you think about that issue?
Yeah, hi. My name is Christina Aldi. I'm from SILIP, the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. And my question is to Josh. And I'm wondering whether you think, given what you said, that the US is overreacting to the Turkish no vote and critical approach to Israel. And also, what do you make of Turkey's relationship with Brazil?
Hi, thanks for your presentation. My name is Diego Han. I'm from Southeast Europe Project at the Wilson International Center, and my question is for Julia, or both of you could answer that. I think I'm going to go back to the question of demographic changes. I know you both mentioned demographic changes within Turkey, whether it is population growth or education, etc. But I just couldn't help disagreeing with you when you said about the immigration issues are focused on countries such as Germany or France or other major 4 or 5 countries out of the EU 27. Though actually we're talking about millions and millions numbers of the immigrants within those countries, but also we're seeing a great range of freedom of movement in the entire EU 27 countries. So I was wondering if you could comment on any demographic changes or any whether the Turkey's accession will bring positive effects on social cohesion or economic and political integration and participation within immigrants in those major countries or anywhere in Europe. Thank you.
Okay. Did you get all the questions?
I got them.
Okay, go ahead.
Let me tee off with Camille's question. I mean, you put your finger on it. That's exactly what Turkey's hoping to do. One of our colleagues, actually, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who's one of the co-authors, wrote about kind of Turkey's democracy promotion or its democracy agenda. What's interesting is it doesn't have an agenda. The word democracy does not show up in any of its statements about what it's trying to do in the Middle East. But when you talk to officials privately, they are very much aware of what this means. In other words, when Turkey looks to engage all actors, even unsavory actors like Hezbollah, Hamas, other groups that America and the West cannot work with, it's precisely thinking of this idea: how do we have a more open, democratic Middle East? The fact is, Turkey is one of the few kind of indigenous democracies in the region. In other words, Turkey's experience with Mustafa Kemal Ataturk from the founding onward is very much a 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. Turkey is not a perfect democracy, and it's precisely because it's not a perfect democracy that it's the perfect kind of interlocutor, the perfect country to go and work with these other countries. When Turkey sends its kind of election officials to Kabul and to Afghanistan and to Pakistan and other places, and it sees different forms of corruption that maybe Westerners are less comfortable with, the Turks kind of look at this and say, okay, yeah, that looks like what it used to be like in the 1960s for us. And in fact, when you look at these other countries, the way they perceive Turkey, it is a major asset, right? And so I think that what Turkey is trying to do with its engagement with its neighborhood in terms of getting to zero, trying to figure out a way, I mean, Turkey's overall strategic interest in the Middle East is to see an open, pluralistic, stable environment. That tracks almost identically to the US. The difference is how we do it. When the US goes into the region, everybody suspects us of doing everything. I mean, the bottom line is from anybody in the Middle East, whether it's from Istanbul to Cairo, everything is run by the CIA. I mean, that's just the way things work. Obviously, everything that happens in the world, whether it's an earthquake or a terrorist attack, is run from Washington. That's the way it works. Now, when Turkey does this, nobody has the same suspicions. I mean, yes, there are lingering doubts and suspicions about Turkey, but I think Turkey has a much better hand to play in this regard. And I think that the idea of kind of having these close relations that sometimes sit uncomfortably with the West, the idea that Turkey has these relations with Hezbollah and Hamas and Syria and Iran and the axis of evil, should not concern us as much, because I'd much rather have Turkey have those close relations than other players have those relations. And I think that it's part of it is being able to understand what the intentionality behind it is. And I think a lot of what Turkey's trying to do is, look, we'll work with whoever's in power. I was very frustrated when the Turks were the second country, to recognize Ahmadinejad in the midst of the Green movement, in the midst of all this horrible uprising. They were the first ones to jump out and say congratulations, because they said, look, he's going to be in power. Clearly he's running the country. We want to get on his good side. And when you think back to the Iran sanctions vote, it also, the Turks kind of miscalculated on how badly they thought we would take this. They assumed that an abstention and a no vote, since they're not a permanent member, meant the same thing. And they tried to explain to us, look, by saying no, we're actually helping you because we'll keep our relations with Iran. That was completely missed in Washington. It was completely missed on the side of the Turks to see how seriously they take it. But I mean, to me, what they're trying to do fundamentally is a good thing. The question is, does the real world, in terms of the realpolitik kind of environment, allow this kind of more idealistic view and kind of a more philosophical approach to foreign policy? We're seeing the limits of it right now. If you'd asked me a year ago, I'd probably be a little bit more optimistic than I am today. And unfortunately today, when we have a discussion about it, there's a lot more problems that I see on the horizon than some of the more positive aspects, which leads me to the second question. Is the US overreacting? Yes, absolutely. I mean, I think the Turks are overreacting. I think the Americans are overreacting. Especially DC. I tend to see that people, when I say DC, let me be clear, I don't mean the administration. I think the administration has been relatively helpful and has worked very closely. I used to work in the State Department. When I look at what the State Department's doing is they're trying to ratchet down the problems that are there. But when I look at the domestic players, whether it's on Capitol Hill and the different comments from congressmen and senators about Turkey, switching sides and is it supporting a terrorist organization and blaming Turkey for what happened on the ships, that looks particularly unhelpful to me. And it looks to me like that's just domestic politics. And I think that, in a globalized environment in which the media picks up on any comment anywhere in the world, you have to be careful. We're playing a two-level game here. That might be good for your domestic constituency here in your home state, but the way it plays in Turkey, or the way that comments by the Prime Minister in Turkey off the record affect us, you have to be careful. I think politicians need to be more leaders, as opposed to what Juliette was saying earlier, which is kind of taking public opinion. This thing with Turkey, Brazil is absolutely fascinating. What's fascinating about it is, if you didn't have the Brazil component, then I would think you'd have a very strong argument of why Turkey's turning Islamist. But the fact is, what does Brazil have to gain in this whole situation? I mean, to me, what Turkey and Brazil are doing together is demonstrating that the world has changed. No longer can the quote-unquote big boys of the world, the European or the P5 members, dictate to the rest of the world how things are done. Brazil and Turkey are very important rising states in their respective neighborhoods. They're pivotal states. They are kind of the key for those regions, whether it's Latin America or the Middle East. And by coming together and working on this, I mean, my understanding of the reason that the deal in Iran went the way it was is the Iranians wanted to give Lula something. He was coming on a visit, and the Americans miscalculated fundamentally how badly the Iranians wanted to give Lula something to go home with. And so the moment that Lula arrived and they began to realize that, hey, we might actually be able to negotiate this letter that the Americans sent you back in April, which the Turks and the Brazilians fundamentally miscalculated in terms of that was 7 months ago. The enrichment has already increased. The Turks got involved immediately. But the Turks, if you listen to what they say from the very beginning, this was a Brazilian initiative. We were asked to come in. we from the very beginning have been wanting to facilitate something like this, but we realize what happens when every time we do this. You guys overreact every time we do anything with Iran. So therefore, we're doing it with the Brazilians. And so Brazil is an important piece of the story. If Brazil had not been involved, I don't think fundamentally Turkey would have done this on its own, and I don't think Turkey would have voted the way it did. Brazil is crucial to the story.
Juliette, any thoughts on this?
I just would like to add something on the whole, is Turkey leading to more open societies in the Middle East or not? I totally agree with what Joshua said. I just want to add one anecdote. Is Joshua and I, we went to Syria back in October, and we talked there with a couple of people, and kind of the stories that we heard kind of several times was that it's obviously a very good mood for Syria to kind of get closer to Turkey and open the border and have more cooperation and everything. But either way, it was a little bit of a dangerous move for Assad, because having so many people going to Turkey, seeing how it is, type of society it is, they might just come back to Syria and having a little bit more democratic demand and kind of expect Syria to be a little bit more like Turkey. So I think it goes into this argument that our colleagues is working on, that Turkey, by cooperating with not particularly very democratic regimes, but by talking to them and kind of engaging them is, kind of by demonstration, not intentionally, but unintentionally might be leading. I mean, we need to wait a couple of years and see how these things work out. But I think there is something here that might be happening.
Well, thank you.
And I just had a question on
Yes,
demography. I'm sorry. Yes, I totally agree with what you said. Let me come back. When I said that there is an immigration problem in those couple of countries, indeed there is an immigration problem. I personally think that it's not a problem with migrants. I think it's more a problem of perception and framing of the issues, and that for some reason there are some blockages there that people are not able to overcome, but hopefully there will soon. And I think one of the key words is something that you said, is that within the EU area you have this freedom of movement. Like, you don't have any borders anymore. Everyone within the EU can travel as much as you want. You can work wherever you want. And I think this is helping a lot integrating internally with the EU. If Turkey is within the EU, and probably, we don't know when Turkey is going to be in the EU if it happens, and probably once it happens, there will probably be this kind of limitations, probably like 7 or 10 years limitation, where freedom of movement will basically come later after a couple of years. But I think once we reach that stage, we're going to see that it's going to ease a lot the immigration problem, because we have, a lot of my friends, my Turkish friends in Paris, they are really kind of in a way trapped in a situation where they are dying to go back to Turkey, because they want to see more family. They have kind of this, Turkey is developing and there are good things, but they're afraid that if they do so, they will not be able to go back again to France or to Germany or to wherever. So I think just if we reach that point of having free borders, it will ease everything. Like, people will be, if they want to go back, they can go back. If they want to stay, they can stay. It will also have signaled really importantly that the EU is an inclusive project, and Turkish people have their place as anyone else in this EU construction. And so in terms of this perception and framing, it's going to change a lot the way people behave, and then it's going to be kind of a traditional issue of how to integrate population that have different qualification, and how to deal with unemployment, and kind of more traditional socioeconomic issues, but not so much the identity thing and the freedom of movement, which is key here.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating discussion. Actually, I think there may be some themes that you were addressing that could be the subject of a whole discussion. For example, the issue of Turkey and the promotion of democracy in the Middle East. I personally think that it's not a black and white question, that there are actions that Turkey's taking, its example, that may be promoting democracy, and I think there are Turkish actions that might be setting back democracy. Okay. So it's a complex issue, but it's probably worth a separate discussion. Anyway, thank you very much for a fascinating talk, and thank you to the audience for excellent questions and participation.